I don't know when it started, this gnawing feeling in my gut that something wasn't right. At first, I thought it was just paranoia, you know? Maybe I was overthinking things because work had been slow for me lately and I had too much time on my hands. But as the days turned into weeks, it became harder to ignore. My wife, Emily, wasn't the same. Not with me, not at home, not even in the little routines that had once made us. She started staying late at work, more often than not. She's in marketing, a high-stress field, so I understood the occasional late night. But it became a pattern, a frustratingly consistent one. Her excuses were always airtight. "We're finalizing the campaign," or "My boss, Mr. Collins, wants the presentation perfect before tomorrow." Mr. Collins. That name started to leave a bitter taste in my mouth. I didn't even know the guy, but the way she spoke about him, it was different. It wasn't just respect or admiration. It was almost like reverence. And then, there were the secretive phone calls. Emily would step into the hallway or out onto the porch when her phone buzzed, her voice dropping just low enough that I couldn't make out the words. Whenever I asked, she'd wave it off. "Work stuff, honey," she'd say, planting a quick kiss on my cheek before disappearing into another room. But the kiss wasn't the same anymore. It felt rushed, like a chore she had to check off her list. Her distance wasn't just emotional, it was physical too. The woman who once leaned into my shoulder during movie nights now sat at the edge of the couch, engrossed in her phone. The warmth that had been a constant in our marriage was slowly being replaced by an invisible wall, one that I couldn't climb no matter how hard I tried. I remember one evening vividly. We were sitting at the dinner table, and I asked her how her day went. She lit up, her eyes sparkling as she talked about a new project. But the way she said it, Mr. Collins had this brilliant idea, made my stomach churn. I forced a smile, nodding as if I cared about her boss's brilliance. Deep down, I knew I was losing her to something or someone I couldn't see. Still, I told myself it was all in my head. Maybe I was insecure. Maybe I was projecting my own frustrations about work onto her. I even blamed myself for not being the exciting husband she deserved. But then came the moment that changed everything. It was a Saturday afternoon. Emily was out running errands, and I was tidying up around the house when her phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. Normally, I wouldn't touch it. We'd always had this unspoken rule about privacy, but something compelled me. An instinct I couldn't ignore. I picked up the phone and glanced at the screen. It was a message from Alpha Collins. My blood ran cold. I didn't open the message immediately. My hands were shaking so badly that I had to put the phone down and take a deep breath. Then I tapped on the screen. "Can't wait to see you Monday. You looked stunning yesterday, as always." My heart sank. Stunning? Yesterday? She told me she was working late in the office, yet here was her boss, complimenting her like they were on a date. I didn't know whether to feel angry, betrayed, or just stupid for not seeing it sooner. I didn't confront her right away. Instead, I spent the rest of the day in a haze, replaying every interaction we'd had over the past few weeks. The puzzle pieces were falling into place, and the picture they painted was one I didn't want to see. My wife, the woman I'd built a life with, shared dreams with, was slipping away from me. And the worst part? She didn't even seem to notice. That night, as she sat on the couch scrolling through her phone, I sat across from her, studying her face. I wanted to scream, to ask her why, to beg her to tell me I was wrong. But I didn't. Instead, I smiled and asked if she wanted tea. Because sometimes, when you're standing at the edge of a cliff, you need a moment to steady yourself before deciding whether to jump or pull back. I wasn't ready to jump. Not yet. Sunday morning came, and I woke up before Emily. I lay there for a while, staring at the ceiling, the weight of yesterday's discovery pressing down on me. Alpha Collins. I kept repeating the name in my head, like a mantra that made me angrier with each repetition. It felt so ridiculous, like something out of a bad soap opera. But this wasn't fiction. This was my life. And somehow, my wife was at the center of it with him. She was still asleep when I got up, her phone lying on the bedside table, screen down. I glanced at it, that same instinct from the day before gnawing at me. I didn't want to be the guy who snoops through his wife's phone, But what choice did I have now? She'd crossed a line, and I needed answers. I picked up the phone, my hands trembling again. The lock screen stared back at me, mocking my hesitation. But then I remembered something. Emily once mentioned that she used my birthday as her passcode because it was easy to remember. The irony wasn't lost on me as I keyed in those 4 digits and watched the phone unlock. My stomach churned as I scrolled through her messages. Most of them were innocent enough. Chats with her friends, reminders from her mom. But then I found the thread with Alpha Collins. I opened it, and there it was. Everything I'd been afraid of, spelled out in cold, unfeeling text. Last night was amazing. I love how you laugh when you're with me. Don't let him make you feel guilty. You deserve better. Counting the days until I can hold you again. Each message felt like a dagger, twisting deeper with every word. I could practically hear his smug, condescending tone in my head. And Emily, my Emily, was replying with hearts and smiling emojis, like a love-struck teenager. I sat down on the edge of the bed, my breath coming in shallow gasps. My hands were gripping the phone so tightly that I thought I might crush it. My mind raced, trying to process what I was reading. Was this really happening? Was my wife, the woman I trusted more than anyone, having an affair with her boss? And then I saw it. A photo. I almost didn't want to open it, but my finger moved before I could stop myself. It was a picture of them, taken in what looked like a fancy restaurant. She was dressed in the same outfit she'd worn on one of her supposed late nights at work. Her smile was radiant, but it wasn't for me. It was for him. The betrayal hit me like a punch to the gut. It wasn't just the texts or the photo. It was everything. The lies, the secrecy, the way she'd slowly pulled away from me without even giving me a chance to fight for her. And then there was him, this so-called alpha, who thought he could walk into my wife's life and take what didn't belong to him. I put the phone down, my head in my hands. I felt a mix of emotions, anger, sadness, humiliation. I wanted to wake her up, to demand an explanation, to make her look me in the eye and tell me why. But I didn't. Not yet. I needed time to think, to figure out what I was going to do. When Emily finally woke up, she smiled at me like nothing was wrong. "Morning, honey," she said, her voice warm and cheerful. I stared at her, wondering how she could act so normal when she was hiding something so devastating. Part of me wanted to call her out right then and there, but another part of me wanted to wait, to gather more evidence, to make sure I wasn't missing anything. So I played along. I kissed her on the forehead, made her breakfast, and pretended like everything was fine. But inside, I was falling apart. Every time she smiled at me, I wondered if she was thinking about him. Every time her phone buzzed, I wondered if it was another message from her so-called alpha. By the end of the day, I had made up my mind. I couldn't ignore this any longer. I needed answers, and I needed them from her. But this wasn't going to be a screaming match or a rushed confrontation. No, I wanted to hear her say it. I wanted her to admit what she had done and look me in the eyes when she did it. That night, as we sat on the couch watching TV, I turned to her and said, "Emily, we need to talk." She froze, her hand halfway to the popcorn bowl. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice cautious. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "I know about you and Collins." Her face turned pale, and for a moment she didn't say anything. Then she laughed nervously. "What are you talking about?" I pulled out her phone, showing her the messages and the photo. "This," I said, my voice low and steady. "This is what I'm talking about." Her eyes widened, and for the first time, I saw genuine fear in them. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. And in that moment, I knew I had her. The room was dead silent. Emily just sat there, her face pale and her mouth slightly open, as if she couldn't believe I'd actually confronted her. I didn't say anything at first. I just let the weight of the evidence sink in. Her phone was still in my hand, the messages staring back at both of us like the undeniable truth they were. "You're not even going to deny it, are you?" I finally said, my voice calm but trembling slightly at the edges. She looked down, avoiding my gaze. "It's not what it looks like," she whispered. But even she didn't sound convinced by her own words. Not what it looks like? I repeated, my voice rising. Emily, I read the messages. I saw the picture. Don't insult me by pretending there's some innocent explanation for this. She finally looked up at me, her eyes filled with something that wasn't guilt. It was defiance. Okay, she said, crossing her arms. Yes, I've been spending time with Collins, but it's not like I planned for this to happen. It just did. It just did. Those words hit me harder than any punch ever could, as if cheating on your husband was something that could just happen, like tripping over a crack in the sidewalk. My hands clenched into fists, but I forced myself to stay calm. Losing my temper wouldn't solve anything. So, what? I asked, my voice cold. You accidentally fell into his arms? Accidentally let him call you stunning and tell you that you deserve better? Is that how it works? She flinched but didn't back down. You don't understand, she said, her tone defensive. He makes me feel appreciated. He listens to me. Don't, I interrupted, holding up a hand. Don't you dare finish that sentence, because whatever he does for you, it doesn't justify what you've done to me. To us. Her expression softened for a moment, and I thought maybe, just maybe, she would apologize. But then, her defenses went back up. Maybe if you'd been more present, she snapped, I wouldn't have needed someone else to make me feel special. That was it. The floodgates opened, and all the anger I'd been holding back came rushing out. Are you kidding me? I said, standing up. I've been here, Emily. Every single day, I've been here trying to be the best husband I can be. But apparently, that's not good enough for you because your boss decided to play the role of the alpha male. And you fell for it. She stood up too, her eyes blazing. You think this is easy for me? She shot back. Do you have any idea how lonely I've felt? How much pressure I'm under at work? Collins understands that. He supports me in ways you never have. I laughed bitterly. Oh, he supports you, does he? I'm sure that's what he tells every woman he's sleeping with. You think you're special, Emily? To him, you're just another conquest. Her face turned red, whether from anger or shame, I couldn't tell. You don't know him, she said through gritted teeth. And I don't need to, I replied. I know enough. I know he's a coward who preys on women who are too blind to see through his act, and I know that you let him. We stood there, facing off like two boxers in the ring. I was angry, hurt, and disgusted all at once. But more than anything, I was disappointed. Disappointed in her, in our marriage, and in myself for not seeing this coming. Here's what's going to happen, I said, my voice low and steady. You're going to end this. Today. You're going to tell him it's over, and you're going to cut all contact with him. If you don't, you can pack your bags and leave because I'm not going to share my wife with another man. Her eyes narrowed. You don't get to tell me what to do. Oh, I think I do, I shot back. Because the moment you decided to cheat on me, you forfeited the right to play the victim. So it's your choice, Emily. Him or me. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she sat back down on the couch, her face unreadable. I waited, my heart pounding in my chest. After what felt like an eternity, she finally spoke. I need time to think. I shook my head, a bitter laugh escaping my lips. Time to think? You've had plenty of time to think while sneaking around behind my back. But fine. Take your time. Just know that my patience is running out. I turned and walked out of the room, my hands still shaking. Part of me wanted to believe she'd choose me, that our marriage could be saved. But another part of me, the part that had read those texts and seen that photo, wasn't so sure. I wasn't going to wait forever. If she didn't make her choice soon, I was prepared to make it for her. I didn't sleep that night. I lay awake in the dark, staring at the ceiling, replaying every word of our argument. Him or me. It felt like a line from a movie, dramatic and cliched, but it was the only way I could put it. The ball was in her court now, and I hated that. I hated giving her the power to decide whether our marriage lived or died. The next morning, she left for work without saying much. Just a quick, awkward goodbye before slipping out the door. I watched her drive off, my chest heavy with the weight of everything unsaid. I told myself I'd give her time, like I promised. But the hours dragged on, and with every passing minute, my anger simmered. By noon, I couldn't take it anymore. Sitting around, waiting for her to make a decision, it felt like torture. I needed to do something. And so, against my better judgment, I got in my car and drove to her office. The building was sleek and modern, all glass windows and polished steel. I parked in a visitor's spot and sat there for a few minutes, trying to calm myself. Part of me wanted to turn around and go home. Barging into her workplace wasn't exactly a smart move. But then I thought about Alpha Collins and all the smug, patronizing things he'd probably said to her, about me, about our marriage. And my resolve hardened. I walked into the lobby, trying to look calm and collected. The receptionist greeted me with a polite smile, and I asked to see Mr. Collins. She raised an eyebrow but didn't ask questions, just picked up the phone and dialed. After a brief conversation, she nodded and told me to head to the second floor. His office was at the end of a long hallway, the door wide open. As I approached, I could see him sitting at his desk, typing on his computer. He looked exactly like I'd imagined. Expensive suit, perfect hair, the kind of guy who thought the world owed him something just because he existed. "Mr. Collins?" I said, stepping into the room. He looked up, surprised, and then his expression shifted to one of smug amusement. "You must be Emily's husband," he said, leaning back in his chair. "I was wondering when I'd get to meet you." The way he said it, so casual, like he'd been expecting me, it made my blood boil. "We need to talk," I said, my voice tight. He gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Please, have a seat." I ignored the chair and stayed standing. "I know about you and Emily," I said, cutting straight to the point, "and I'm here to tell you it ends now." He raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "Is that so?" "Yes," I said, my voice firm. "Whatever you think you have with her, it's over. She's my wife, and you need to stay away from her." He chuckled, a low, condescending sound that made my fists clench. "Look," he said, leaning forward. "I get it. This must be hard for you. But Emily's a grown woman. She makes her own decisions. If she wants to be with me, that's her choice." "Her choice," I repeated, my voice rising. "You manipulated her. You took advantage of her stress, her vulnerabilities. That's not a choice. That's coercion." He stood up then, his smile fading. "Let me make something clear," he said, his tone colder now. "Emily came to me, not the other way around. And if she's unhappy in your marriage, that's not my problem. Maybe you should look in the mirror before blaming me." I took a step closer, my anger bubbling to the surface. "Listen to me," I said, my voice low and steady. "I'm only going to say this once. Stay away from my wife or you'll regret it." He smirked, clearly unfazed by my warning. "Are you threatening me?" he asked, his voice dripping with mockery. "It's not a threat," I said. "It's a promise." For a moment, we just stood there, staring each other down. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, but I didn't back down. Eventually, he shrugged and sat back down in his chair. "I'll tell you what," he said, his tone light again. "I'll give Emily some space to figure out what she wants, but don't think for a second that you can intimidate me. I don't scare easily." I didn't bother responding. There was nothing more to say. I turned and walked out of his office, my fists still clenched, my jaw tight. As I drove home, I replayed the conversation in my head, kicking myself for not doing more. But I also knew this wasn't over. Collins wasn't the type to back down, and neither was I. I thought I'd made myself clear when I left his office. I thought my warning, even if he'd laughed it off, would at least make him think twice before pulling any more stunts. But I was wrong. Dead wrong. It was a quiet evening at home. Emily and I had barely spoken since she came back from work. She'd been avoiding me, and honestly, I was fine with that. The air between us was thick with tension, words unsaid hanging like a storm cloud. I was sitting in the living room, nursing a glass of water and flipping through TV channels, more for the noise than anything else. Then the doorbell rang. At first I thought it was one of the neighbors, maybe dropping off mail delivered to the wrong address. I wasn't expecting anyone. Emily was in the kitchen and she didn't move. So I sighed, got up, and headed to the door. When I opened it, my breath caught in my chest. Standing there, smug as ever, was Collins. He was wearing his usual tailored suit, but there was something more menacing about him now. He had that same cocky smirk on his face, as if showing up uninvited to another man's house was completely normal. "What the hell are you doing here?" I asked, my voice low, barely keeping my anger in check. He didn't even flinch. He brushed past me, stepping into my house without so much as an invitation. "Relax," he said, casually looking around like he was inspecting the place. "I thought we could have a little chat, man to man." "Get out," I said, my voice firm this time. "Not until we settle a few things," he replied, turning to face me. His smirk was gone now, replaced by a cold, calculating expression that made my skin crawl. "You see, you came into my office yesterday threatening me. I didn't appreciate that." I clenched my fists, my jaw tightening. "And yet here you are, proving my point about being a smug, arrogant—" "Careful," he interrupted, his tone sharp. "You're already in over your head. Let me make something clear. Emily is with me because she wants to be. You can yell, threaten, or throw tantrums all you want, but you can't change that." His words hit like a punch to the gut. I wanted to scream, to tell him he was wrong, but the confidence in his voice shook me. Before I could respond, Emily walked into the room. Her eyes widened when she saw him, and she froze. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice a mixture of shock and nervousness. "Just having a conversation with your husband," he said smoothly, his demeanor shifting to something almost charming. "It seems he's having a hard time understanding the situation." Emily looked at me, then back at him, her face pale. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice trembling. "Why not?" he asked, stepping closer to her. "I'm just trying to clear the air. Isn't that what you wanted? Honesty?" That was it. I'd had enough. I stepped between them, my body tense, my voice shaking with rage. I said, "Get out." Collins looked at me, his smirk returning. "Or what?" he asked, leaning in slightly, daring me to make a move. And then it happened. Without warning, he slapped me. A hard, stinging slap that echoed through the room. For a moment, I just stood there, stunned. Emily gasped, covering her mouth with her hands. Collins didn't even flinch. He just stood there, looking at me like I was beneath him. "You don't deserve her," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "You're weak, pathetic. No wonder she came to me." Time seemed to slow down. The room blurred, and all I could hear was my heartbeat pounding in my ears. My vision tunneled on him, his smug face, his arrogant posture. He had crossed the line, not just as a man, but as a human being. He had come into my home, insulted me, disrespected me, and now he'd laid hands on me. Something snapped inside me. A lifetime of patience, restraint, and compromise crumbled in an instant. I didn't think. I didn't plan. I just moved. My hand shot out, grabbing his arm before he could step back. His smirk faltered, replaced by surprise and then fear as I twisted his wrist. "You think you can come into my house, insult me and walk away?" I growled, my voice low and dangerous. He tried to pull away, but I didn't let go. With a surge of strength I didn't know I had, I forced him down, twisting his arm until I heard the sickening crack of bone. He screamed, a high-pitched, panicked sound that only fueled my anger. I let go, and he stumbled back, clutching his now useless hand, his face pale with pain. Emily screamed, rushing forward, but I stopped her with a look. "Stay back," I said, my voice cold. Collins looked at me, his bravado gone, replaced by fear. "You're insane," he spat, cradling his broken hand. "You'll pay for this." "Get out of my house," I said, stepping toward him. "And if I ever see you again, you'll leave with more than a broken hand." He didn't argue. He staggered to the door, throwing one last glare over his shoulder before disappearing into the night. I turned to Emily, who was staring at me like she didn't recognize the man in front of her. "This ends now," I said, my voice trembling with emotion. "You decide tonight, Emily, him or me." And with that, I walked away, leaving her standing in the wreckage of everything we'd built. When Collins finally limped out of my house, clutching his broken hand like the coward he truly was, I didn't feel the relief I expected. Instead, there was a strange stillness. The air felt heavier, as if the weight of everything that had happened was pressing down on me. I stood in the living room for a moment, staring at the door he'd just slammed behind him. My chest heaved with deep, uneven breaths, but my mind was eerily calm. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I was the one in control. Emily stood a few feet away, frozen. Her hands were clasped over her mouth, and her wide eyes darted between me and the door. It was almost as if she didn't recognize me anymore. Maybe she didn't. Maybe I didn't recognize myself either. "You broke his hand," she finally whispered, her voice barely audible. I turned to her, my face unreadable. "What did you expect me to do, Emily? Let him walk in here, slap me, insult me, and leave like nothing happened?" My voice wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of everything I was feeling. Anger, hurt, betrayal. She shook her head, her hands trembling. I didn't think you'd do that." I let out a bitter laugh, shaking my head. "Of course you didn't, because you've spent the last few weeks convincing yourself that I'm weak, that I'm the lesser man compared to your alpha boss. Isn't that what he told you? That I don't deserve you?" She didn't answer, and her silence was all the confirmation I needed. I took a step closer to her, my voice hardening. "You let him into our lives, Emily. You let him come between us. And when he showed up here, in our house, you didn't even try to stop him. You just stood there watching while he disrespected me, while he slapped me. So don't you dare act shocked now that I stood up for myself." Her lower lip trembled, and for a moment, I thought she might cry. But then her expression hardened, and she crossed her arms. "You didn't have to break his hand," she snapped, her voice rising. "You've turned this into something even worse." "Worse?" I shot back, my anger flaring again. "You think I made this worse? Let me remind you, Emily, you're the one who cheated. You're the one who brought him into our lives. I'm just cleaning up the mess you made." The words hit her like a slap, and she recoiled, her face pale. I almost felt bad for a second. Almost. But then I remembered the texts, the late nights, the lies. Whatever guilt I felt was drowned out by the memory of how she had betrayed me. "You need to make a decision," I said, my voice calmer now, but no less firm. "I've already told you, him or me, and I'm not waiting any longer. If you want to be with him, fine. Pack your things and go. But if you choose to stay, this ends. No more contact with him, no more lies, no more excuses." She stared at me, her mouth opening and closing like she wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. Finally, she sank onto the couch, her head in her hands. "I need time," she murmured, her voice muffled. I let out a sharp breath, running a hand through my hair. "You've had time, Emily. Weeks of it. I've been sitting here, waiting, hoping you'd come to your senses. But all you've done is push me further away. So, no, you don't get more time. You make your choice tonight, or I'll make it for you." I walked out of the living room, leaving her sitting there in stunned silence. My heart was pounding, and my hands were still shaking from the confrontation. Part of me wanted to give in, to let her take all the time she needed. But another part of me, the part that had been humiliated, disrespected, and hurt, knew that time wasn't the answer. She had to face the consequences of her actions, just like I had to face the reality of what our marriage had become. I went to our bedroom and shut the door, leaning against it as I tried to catch my breath. My reflection in the mirror across the room caught my eye. I looked different, tired, angry, a little broken. But there was something else, too. Strength. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I'd reclaimed a piece of myself. The night dragged on. I could hear Emily pacing in the living room, occasionally muttering to herself. I didn't go out there, and she didn't come to me. We were in a stalemate, both of us trying to figure out what came next. But deep down, I already knew. The choice she made tonight would determine the rest of our lives. The next morning, I woke up to an empty bed. I wasn't surprised. Emily had barely slept the night before. I could hear her pacing until the early hours. Part of me had hoped that when I got up, she'd already have made a decision, one way or the other. But when I walked into the kitchen, she was sitting at the table, staring into a cold cup of coffee, looking as though she hadn't moved in hours. She didn't look up when I entered. I grabbed a glass of water and leaned against the counter, watching her. I could tell she hadn't slept. Her hair was messy, her face pale, and her eyes red. Guilt or exhaustion? I couldn't tell. "So?" I finally asked, breaking the silence. She flinched, her hands gripping the mug tighter. "So what?" she mumbled without looking at me. "You know what?" I said, my voice steady. "Have you made your choice?" Her shoulders slumped, and she let out a shaky breath. "I don't know what to do," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I set the glass down a little harder than I intended. "What's there to think about, Emily? You've been living two lives, and now it's time to pick one. Him or me." She looked up at me then, her eyes filled with tears. "It's not that simple." "It is that simple," I shot back, my voice rising. "You made it complicated when you let him into our lives. You chose to cheat. You chose to betray me. And now you're telling me you're stuck in some kind of moral gray area? Come on, Emily, be honest. If you want to be with him, just say it." Her face crumpled and the tears started to fall. I hated seeing her like this, but I couldn't let myself soften. Not this time. She needed to face the consequences of what she'd done. "I don't want to lose you," she said finally, her voice trembling. "But I don't know if we can come back from this." That hit me harder than I expected. I had braced myself for anger, for excuses, even for her choosing him. But this, her doubt, her hesitation, cut deeper than any of that. It felt like she was dangling our marriage over a cliff, unsure whether to save it or let it fall. "I can't make that decision for you," I said, my voice quieter now. "But I'll tell you this. I'm not going to wait around forever. If you want to fix this, if you want to fix us, then you need to let him go. Completely. No contact, no excuses, no lingering feelings. Otherwise, we're done." She nodded slowly, but I wasn't convinced. Words were easy, actions were harder, and I'd already seen how far her actions had taken her away from me. The rest of the day passed in a tense, uneasy silence. I busied myself with household tasks, anything to keep my mind off the mess we were in. Emily stayed in the bedroom for most of the day, and I let her. She needed space to figure things out, and honestly, so did I. But by evening, my patience was wearing thin. As I sat on the couch, staring blankly at the TV, I heard the bedroom door open. Emily walked into the living room, her face pale but resolute. She sat down across from me, folding her hands in her lap. "I ended it," she said, her voice steady. I raised an eyebrow, unsure whether to believe her. "Just like that?" She nodded. "I called him. I told him it was over and that I didn't want any more contact with him. I blocked his number. He tried to argue, but I didn't let him. It's done." I studied her face, looking for any sign of doubt or hesitation. She seemed sincere, but a part of me still struggled to trust her. After everything that had happened, how could I be sure this wasn't just another lie? "And what about us?" I asked. She looked down at her hands, her fingers twisting nervously. "I don't know," she admitted. "I want to fix things, but I don't know how. I've hurt you so much, and I don't even know if you'll ever forgive me." Her honesty took me by surprise. For the first time in weeks, she wasn't defensive or evasive. She was just vulnerable. It didn't erase what she'd done, but it was a start. "I don't know if I can forgive you either," I said honestly. "But I'm willing to try, as long as you're willing to do the work." She nodded, tears filling her eyes again. "I am," she said, her voice breaking. "I don't want to lose you." The weight of her words hung in the air, heavy and fragile. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that we could rebuild what had been broken. But I also knew it wouldn't be easy. Trust, once shattered, doesn't come back overnight. For now, though, it was enough. Enough to take the first step. Enough to keep going one day at a time. The days that followed were anything but easy. After Emily told me she'd ended things with Collins, I wanted to believe her. I really did. But trust isn't something you can just snap back into place. It's like a mirror. Once it's cracked, you can glue the pieces together, but it'll never be the same again. And every time I looked at her, all I could see were the cracks. She stayed true to her word, though. She blocked his number, deleted his messages, even quit her job to sever all ties with him. That last one caught me off guard. Emily had always been passionate about her career, and leaving it behind was a big deal for her. When she told me, I just nodded, trying to process what it meant. Was it a genuine act of repentance, or was it just guilt pushing her to extremes? Either way, it was something. The first week was the hardest. We barely spoke to each other, and when we did, it was awkward and strained. I could tell she was walking on eggshells, afraid to say the wrong thing. And me? I was angry. Not the fiery, shouting kind of anger. No, this was the quiet, simmering kind that sits in your chest and refuses to leave. I didn't yell or lash out, but every now and then, I'd catch myself throwing sharp comments her way, little jabs that I knew would hurt. "You're awfully quiet," I said one evening as we sat at the dinner table. "Thinking about him?" Her fork froze mid-air, and she looked up at me with wide eyes. "No," she said quickly, her voice soft. "I'm thinking about us, about how to fix this." I wanted to believe her. I really did. But a part of me couldn't help wondering if she was still thinking about him, about all the moments they'd shared behind my back. The thought made my stomach churn. But as the days turned into weeks, something shifted. Slowly, tentatively, Emily started trying to rebuild what we'd lost. She cooked my favorite meals, planned little outings for us, even brought home a book on marriage counseling. At first, I brushed off her efforts, too wrapped up in my own hurt to care. But over time, I started to see how hard she was trying. One night, as we sat on the couch watching a movie, she turned to me and said, "I know I've hurt you more than I can ever make up for. But I'm not giving up on us. Even if it takes the rest of my life, I'll do whatever it takes to earn your forgiveness." Her words caught me off guard. For the first time, I saw the pain in her eyes. The pain of someone who knew they'd made a terrible mistake and was desperate to make things right. It didn't erase what she'd done, but it softened something inside me. For the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of hope. We started going to counseling together. I wasn't thrilled about the idea at first, but I knew we couldn't fix this on our own. The sessions were tough. Sitting there, airing out all the hurt and anger in front of a stranger, it wasn't easy, but it was necessary. The counselor didn't take sides, didn't try to sugarcoat things. She made us face the hard truths about our marriage and ourselves. One day, during a particularly emotional session, Emily broke down. "I don't know why I let it happen," she sobbed. "I was lonely, and he made me feel wanted, but it wasn't real. It was selfish and stupid, and I hate myself for what I did to you." Her tears were raw, unfiltered. For the first time, I saw just how deeply she regretted her actions. And as much as I wanted to hold on to my anger, I couldn't. Seeing her like that, so broken and vulnerable, reminded me of the woman I'd fallen in love with, the woman I still loved, despite everything. It didn't happen overnight, but slowly, I began to let go of the anger. We started talking more, laughing more, finding little pieces of joy in the wreckage of our marriage. It wasn't perfect, and it probably never would be, but it was progress. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching, I've always hated these high society parties. Too much champagne, too many forced smiles, and far too many people pretending they're something they're not. But Laura, my wife, thrives in them. She lights up in a way that used to mesmerize me, but now feels like a performance for an audience I don't particularly care to impress. This one was no different. The room was packed with the usual suspects. Wealthy businessmen, their impeccably dressed wives, and the inevitable sprinkling of younger, single men who hovered near the bar scanning the crowd. Laura was in her element, flitting from group to group with a glass of champagne in hand and a laugh that carried across the room. I stayed in the corner, sipping whiskey and nodding politely at conversations I wasn't interested in. That's when I saw him. Julian. Tall, sharp-dressed, and radiating the kind of cocky arrogance that only comes from having more money than sense. He was standing near the buffet table, his eyes locked on Laura as if she were the main course. I didn't like him the moment I laid eyes on him, and it wasn't just because of the way he looked at her. No, it was the way he carried himself, like he was entitled to anything or anyone he wanted. At first, I tried to shake it off. I told myself it was nothing, just a harmless look. But as the night wore on, his gaze never left her. Laura, of course, noticed. How could she not? She's beautiful, and she knows it. It's one of the things that drew me to her when we first met. But tonight, there was something different in the way she responded to the attention. She played into it. Every laugh was louder, every glance lingered longer, every move seemed designed to catch his eye. And it worked. He was hooked, watching her with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I clenched my glass tighter, the whiskey burning my throat as I tried to swallow my anger. This wasn't the first time I'd seen her bask in someone else's attention, but tonight felt different, more deliberate. At one point, she caught my eye from across the room and smiled. A coy, almost teasing smile that seemed to say, "What are you going to do about it?" I didn't respond. I just stared at her, letting her know I wasn't amused. By the time we left the party, my patience was running thin. The drive home was quiet, the tension between us palpable. She was the first to break the silence. "You didn't have to look so miserable," she said, her tone laced with irritation. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel, staring straight ahead. I saw the way he undressed you with his eyes. Her laugh was sharp and humorless. "Oh, please, don't be so dramatic." I pulled into the driveway and turned off the engine, finally looking at her. "Am I being dramatic, Laura? Or are you just pretending you didn't notice?" She met my gaze, her eyes challenging. "And what if I did notice? What if I enjoyed it? What are you going to do about it?" Her words hung in the air, sharp and cutting. For a moment, I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Nothing," I said finally, my voice cold and steady. "I only fight for treasures, not trash." Her face fell, the confidence draining from her expression. For a split second, I saw something that looked like regret, but she quickly masked it, turning her head to look out the window. We sat there in silence, the weight of our conversation pressing down on us like a storm waiting to break. When we finally went inside, I went straight to the study, pouring myself another glass of whiskey as I tried to process what had just happened. This wasn't how our marriage was supposed to be. We were supposed to be partners, equals, a team. But somewhere along the way, we had lost that. I used to think it was my fault, that maybe I wasn't giving her enough attention, enough love. But tonight, I realized it wasn't about me. It was about her need to be seen, to be desired, to feel like the center of someone's world, even if it wasn't mine. As I sat there in the quiet of the study, I knew one thing for certain. Things couldn't go on like this. Something had to change. And if she wasn't willing to change, then I would. Because I wasn't going to spend the rest of my life fighting for someone who didn't want to be fought for. I didn't see it coming. Not the way things started to unravel. Looking back, the signs were there, but hindsight is always sharper than the moment itself. When I first met Laura, she was a force of nature, beautiful, confident, and with a laugh that could light up an entire room. She had this way of making me feel like I was the only man in the world, like I could conquer anything as long as she was by my side. We met at a friend's wedding. I wasn't even planning to go, but Victor, my older brother, had dragged me there, saying I needed to loosen up and stop being a workaholic. I was standing awkwardly by the buffet table, debating whether to leave early, when she walked in wearing a blue dress that made her look like she had stepped out of a dream. It wasn't just her beauty that caught my attention. It was the way she carried herself, like she owned the room without even trying. She smiled at me, and that was it. I was hooked. We spent the entire evening talking, laughing, and sharing stories. By the end of the night, I knew I wanted to see her again. She gave me her number with a teasing grin and said, "Don't make me regret this." I didn't. Our courtship was a whirlwind. Dinners that stretched into the early hours of the morning. Road trips where we sang off-key to the radio. Quiet moments where we planned a future that felt bright and limitless. She made me feel alive in a way I hadn't felt in years, and I made her feel safe. Or so I thought. We got married a year later. The wedding was small but perfect, filled with the people who mattered most. Victor stood by my side as my best man, his usual mix of sarcasm and support keeping me grounded. Laura's best friend, Claire, was her maid of honor, a bubbly and outgoing woman who adored Laura almost as much as I did. For a while, things were perfect. We bought a cozy house, started building our life together, and talked about having kids someday. I threw myself into my career, wanting to give her everything she deserved, and she poured her energy into decorating our home and planning the kind of life we had always dreamed of. But perfection doesn't last, does it? The first crack appeared when I started working longer hours. I didn't mean to. I just wanted to make sure we were financially secure. I thought she understood, but looking back, I can see how much it hurt her. She never said it outright, but I could feel the shift. She started going out more, shopping trips with Claire, brunches that stretched into afternoons, and eventually, parties where I wasn't invited. At first, I didn't mind. I figured she needed her space, her own life outside of our marriage. But then I started noticing little things. The way she'd light up when a stranger complimented her. The way her laughter seemed a little louder, a little freer when she was around people who weren't me. And then there was Claire. Claire adored Laura, but her idea of support was encouraging Laura's worst impulses. If Laura wanted a new dress, Claire would say, "You deserve it." If Laura complained about me working late, Claire would say, "He's lucky to have you. Don't let him take you for granted." I could see how Claire's words fed into Laura's insecurities, her need to feel validated, but I didn't know how to stop it. Every time I tried to bring it up, Laura would brush it off, saying, "Claire's just looking out for me." Meanwhile, Victor was my rock. He wasn't just my brother. He was my closest friend, the one person who could cut through the noise and tell me the truth. "You need to talk to her," Victor said one night after I'd vented to him about Laura's growing distance. "Really talk to her. Not about work, not about logistics, about how you feel." "I've tried," I told him, running a hand through my hair. "She doesn't want to hear it. Every time I bring it up, it turns into a fight." Victor sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Then you need to find another way. If you let this fester, it's only going to get worse." I knew he was right, but I didn't know how to fix it. The truth was, I wasn't blameless. I had my own flaws, my tendency to retreat into work when things got tough, my struggle to express my emotions in a way that made sense to her. I thought providing for her, for us, was enough. I thought my actions would speak louder than words. But Laura wasn't looking for actions. She was looking for attention. The cracks grew wider over time. I'd come home from work to find her already asleep, or worse, out with Claire at another event. When we were together, it felt like we were speaking different languages, each of us trying to be heard, but neither of us really listening. I still loved her. I think I always will. But love isn't enough when the foundation is crumbling. Now, as I sit here in the quiet of our home, I can't help but wonder how we got here. How did we go from being partners, best friends, to this? Maybe it was inevitable. Maybe it was a series of small choices that led us to this moment. Or maybe it was always there, lurking beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. Either way, the cracks are there. And I don't know if we can fix them. I've always prided myself on knowing Laura. Her moods, her habits, the way she smiles when she's genuinely happy versus when she's just putting on a show. So when she started spending more time catching up with Julian, I noticed. At first, it was casual enough. She mentioned him in passing, the way you'd talk about an old friend you hadn't seen in years. "It's funny running into Julian again," she said one evening as we sat in the living room, her feet tucked under her on the couch. "He's doing really well for himself. Still the same old Julian, though. Charming and full of stories." I nodded, distracted by an email on my phone. "That's nice," I said absent-mindedly, not thinking much of it. But then catching up turned into more. She started meeting him for lunch. Then it was dinners. "Just as friends," she assured me. Each time she'd come home glowing, her energy electric in a way I hadn't seen in a long time. "He's hilarious," she said one night, her voice light as she recounted their conversation over wine. "You'd actually like him if you got to know him." I didn't respond. I wasn't interested in getting to know Julian. I was interested in why my wife seemed so eager to spend time with him. Still, I didn't say anything. I told myself I was overthinking it, that it was harmless. Claire, of course, didn't help. "Julian's such a sweetheart," she gushed during one of her visits. "And it's good for Laura to have someone to talk to while you're so busy with work." Her words stung, though I didn't let it show. I knew Claire meant well in her own way, but she had a way of making my efforts feel small, inadequate. "It's not a big deal," Laura said when I finally mentioned how often she was seeing Julian. "We're just catching up. You trust me, don't you?" I did. Or at least I wanted to. But trust only stretches so far when the person you love starts slipping away. It wasn't just the time she spent with Julian. It was everything else. The way she started dressing up more, putting extra effort into her appearance before their lunches or dinners. The way she'd come home and talk about him with a smile that felt too bright, too practiced. And then there was the phone. She used to leave it lying around without a second thought, but now it was always close by, face down on the table or tucked into her pocket. When it buzzed, she'd glance at it quickly, her expression unreadable before setting it aside. I told myself not to jump to conclusions. We had a young son, Ethan, who deserved better than two parents caught in a storm of suspicion and doubt. So instead of confronting her, I threw myself into work and focused on Ethan. He was growing up so fast, too fast. I made it a point to be there for him, even if Laura seemed to be somewhere else entirely. We built forts in the living room, baked cookies that always ended up slightly burnt, and read the same bedtime story over and over until we both knew it by heart. In those moments, I felt like I was holding on to something real, something solid, even as the foundation of my marriage began to feel like quicksand. But no matter how much I tried to focus on Ethan, I couldn't ignore the growing distance between Laura and me. Conversations that used to flow easily now felt stilted, like we were reading from a script we didn't believe in anymore. One night, after Ethan was asleep, I found her sitting at the dining table with a glass of wine, her phone in her hand. She was smiling at something on the screen, her thumb hovering over it like she was about to reply. "What's so funny?" I asked, trying to keep my tone casual. She jumped slightly, startled, and quickly set the phone down. "Oh, nothing," she said, her smile fading. "Just a message from Claire." I didn't press her, but I knew it wasn't Claire. The next day, I found myself sitting in my car outside work, staring at the steering wheel and wondering how we had gotten here. How had we gone from being partners, a team, to this? I thought about Julian, about the way she spoke about him, the way she lit up when his name came up. And for the first time, I wondered if I was fighting a battle I'd already lost. But I couldn't afford to think like that. Not yet. For now, I decided to wait, to watch, to see how far she was willing to go and whether there was anything left between us worth saving. Because while I could ignore the small cracks, the widening chasm between us was impossible to deny. And deep down, I knew it was only a matter of time before everything came to a head. I just wasn't sure if I was ready for what came next. It started with a single moment, a slip in the careful facade Laura had been maintaining. I hadn't been looking for anything that night, but sometimes the truth finds you when you least expect it. I was in the kitchen, pouring myself a glass of water after putting Ethan to bed. The house was quiet, save for the soft murmur of Laura's voice coming from the living room. At first, I thought she was talking to Claire, as she often did in the evenings. But then I caught a name. "Julian," she said, her tone lighter than usual, almost flirtatious. "You shouldn't say things like that." I froze, my hand gripping the glass tightly as I strained to hear the rest. "No, I can't meet tomorrow," she continued, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Damien will be home. Maybe next week." Her laugh followed, soft and tinged with something I couldn't place. I didn't move. I didn't want to give away the fact that I was listening, so I stood there in the dark kitchen, the faint glow from the hallway casting long shadows on the walls. The conversation ended quickly, and I heard her footsteps approaching. I moved to the sink, pretending to wash the glass as she entered. "Oh," she said, startled. "You're still up?" "Couldn't sleep," I replied casually, glancing at her. "Who were you talking to?" She hesitated just for a second before smiling. "Claire," she said smoothly. "We were just catching up." The lie hit me harder than I expected. I nodded, forcing a smile of my own. "Nice. Tell her I said hi next time." She murmured something non-committal and headed upstairs, leaving me alone with the weight of what I'd just heard. The next few days were a blur of observation and quiet suspicion. I started paying closer attention to the little things. The way she always seemed to have her phone nearby. The texts she'd quickly swipe away if I walked into the room. The excuses that were becoming more frequent and less believable. It wasn't until I found the second phone that everything clicked into place. I was in our bedroom, searching for a charger, when I stumbled across a small, unfamiliar phone tucked into the back of her nightstand drawer. At first, I thought it was an old device she'd forgotten about, but when I powered it on, I was greeted by a flurry of notifications from Julian. The messages weren't explicit, but they didn't have to be. The tone, the frequency, it was all there in black and white. Can't wait to see you again. You looked stunning last night. Let me know when he's out of town. I stared at the screen, my chest tightening. There was no mistaking what this was. Instead of confronting her immediately, I took a deep breath and powered the phone off, placing it back exactly where I found it. I needed to be smart about this. Emotional reactions wouldn't get me anywhere. I called Victor the next day, asking him to meet me after work. He was my rock in moments like these. Practical, grounded, and always willing to tell me the hard truths I didn't want to hear. When I told him what I had found, his face darkened. "You're sure about this?" he asked. I nodded. "I overheard her talking to him, found the messages. There's no doubt in my mind." Victor leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "So what's your plan?" "I don't know yet," I admitted. "But I'm not confronting her. Not until I have everything." He nodded thoughtfully. "Smart. If she denies it, you need evidence, something she can't twist or explain away." That's when we came up with the plan. Victor helped me set up a system to keep track of her movements, a combination of subtle monitoring and careful observation. We started small, keeping an eye on her phone activity when she wasn't around, and noting the times she claimed to be out with Claire. I also made a point of staying quieter around her, more observant. She didn't seem to notice, too caught up in whatever fantasy she thought she was living. It wasn't easy. Every text I saw, every subtle lie she told, felt like another dagger to the chest. But I reminded myself that this wasn't just about me. It was about protecting Ethan and ensuring that whatever came next, I would be prepared. The most damning piece of evidence came one Friday evening when she said she was meeting Claire for dinner. I followed her, parking a few blocks away from the restaurant she had mentioned. She wasn't there. Instead, I spotted her walking into a boutique hotel downtown. Alone at first, but soon joined by Julian, who greeted her with the kind of familiarity that made my blood boil. I didn't confront them. I didn't make a scene. I simply watched from a distance, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly I thought it might break. When she finally emerged 2 hours later, she was laughing, her hand resting lightly on Julian's arm. I drove home in silence, my mind racing. The evidence was piling up, and soon there would be no escaping the truth. Not for her, not for Julian, and not for me. I wasn't sure how this would end, but one thing was certain. I wasn't going to be the fool in someone else's story. Not anymore. Julian sat in his penthouse apartment, the city lights glittering below him like a sea of diamonds. A self-satisfied smirk curled his lips as he swirled the bourbon in his glass, the amber liquid catching the glow of the skyline. He enjoyed moments like these, savoring his victories, both the ones already secured and the ones he was meticulously plotting. Laura was just another piece on his chessboard, a trophy in the making. She wasn't the first married woman he'd pursued, but there was something particularly sweet about this conquest. It wasn't just her beauty, though her striking features and effortless grace made her stand out even among the most glamorous women in his orbit. No, what made Laura special was who she was married to. Damien. The name alone made Julian's jaw tighten. He had known Damien for years, their paths crossing in professional and social circles. While Julian had always prided himself on his wealth and charm, Damien represented something he could never quite grasp: integrity, intelligence, and a calm confidence that commanded respect without trying. Where Julian relied on flash and flare to turn heads, Damien's success was quieter, more enduring. It grated on Julian that despite all his efforts to outshine him, Damien seemed indifferent, as if Julian were barely a blip on his radar. That's what this was really about. Laura wasn't just an object of desire. She was a weapon. Winning her wasn't about love or even lust. It was about proving that Julian could take what Damien valued most. He leaned back in his leather chair, the smirk deepening as he remembered how easily Laura had fallen into his web. At the party where they reconnected, he had noticed her immediately. She was stunning, yes, but there was something else. An air of dissatisfaction, a hunger for attention that Damien, in his busy, responsible way, had clearly neglected. Julian had played his role perfectly that night. He knew exactly how to reel her in. The charming smile, the subtle compliments, the way he leaned in just a little closer than necessary. He hadn't needed to push too hard. Laura was already halfway there, her laughter just a touch too loud, her glances lingering just a bit too long. By the time the evening ended, she was practically glowing from the attention he'd lavished on her. It was almost too easy. Over the weeks that followed, Julian had been careful to keep her hooked. He started with casual texts, harmless enough on the surface but always laced with just enough flirtation to keep her intrigued. "You looked amazing the other night. Damien's a lucky man, though I wonder if he knows just how lucky." Her response had been hesitant at first, a polite thank you that hinted at boundaries she wasn't ready to cross. But Julian was patient. He knew how to play the long game. Gradually, he escalated. He made sure to point out every little flaw in her marriage without being too obvious. "It's hard to believe Damien leaves someone like you alone so often. If you were mine, I wouldn't let you out of my sight." Laura would laugh it off, but Julian could see the cracks forming. She started opening up to him, sharing frustrations about Damien's long hours, his distracted demeanor, and the growing distance between them. Julian made sure to play the role of the understanding confidant. "You deserve to be cherished," he'd tell her, his tone dripping with sincerity. "Not just tolerated. You deserve someone who sees you for the incredible woman you are." It wasn't long before Laura began seeking him out, texting him first, suggesting meetups under the guise of catching up. Each time, Julian carefully fed her dissatisfaction, planting seeds of doubt about Damien's love for her. "Does he even notice how beautiful you are? How hard you try? Men like Damien take women like you for granted. They think being a good provider is enough, but they don't realize that attention and affection matter just as much." Her eyes would soften when he said things like that, a mix of longing and guilt flashing across her face. Julian reveled in it. She was teetering on the edge, and he knew it was only a matter of time before she fell completely. But this wasn't just about her. Every glance she gave him, every text she sent, every moment she spent in his company instead of Damien's, it all felt like a victory over the man who had always seemed untouchable. Julian had no illusions about what he was doing. He wasn't interested in a relationship with Laura. He didn't care about her happiness or her future. Once he'd had his fun, he'd move on, leaving her to pick up the pieces of the life she'd thrown away. The ultimate goal wasn't to keep her. It was to break her. Because breaking her meant breaking Damien. He thought about the quiet, composed man who had always seemed to rise above the petty games Julian thrived on. How would Damien react when he realized his perfect wife had been seduced right under his nose? Would he lash out, crumble, walk away without a word? The possibilities were delicious. For now, Julian would continue to play his part, drawing Laura deeper into his web while carefully avoiding anything that might expose him prematurely. He knew how to push just hard enough to keep her hooked without making her panic. Sooner or later, Damien would find out. And when he did, Julian wanted to be there to see it, to watch the man who had always seemed untouchable finally lose. As Julian finished his drink and set the glass down on the table, he smiled to himself. The game was far from over, but he was already winning. After all, he had the ultimate prize in his sights, Damien's pride. And nothing was sweeter than taking something from a man who had everything. It's amazing what clarity can do. Once the initial shock of Laura's betrayal faded, my mind sharpened. I wasn't just angry anymore. I was focused. Reacting emotionally wouldn't fix anything. Yelling, accusing, making dramatic scenes, none of that would help. If I was going to protect my family, especially Ethan, I needed to approach this calmly and deliberately. Laura might think she was in control, but that illusion wouldn't last. The first thing I did was shift my attention. Ethan became my anchor. Every time I looked at him, I saw the one pure thing in all this chaos. He deserved better than the instability Laura was dragging into our home. So I made it my mission to give him the security he needed, even if I had to fake my own calm for his sake. I started spending more time with him. At first, it was little things. Helping with his homework, cooking dinner together, reading his favorite books at bedtime. But soon, it became the best part of my day. "Dad, can we build a fort?" he asked one Saturday morning, his eyes lighting up with excitement. "Absolutely," I said, setting aside the newspaper. We spent hours rearranging furniture, draping blankets, and creating our own little world in the living room. When it was done, he crawled inside and declared it the safest place in the world. I smiled, feeling a pang in my chest. That's what I wanted for him. Safety, security, love. He didn't need to see the cracks forming in our family, and I was determined to keep it that way for as long as I could. Laura noticed the change. "You're spending a lot of time with Ethan lately," she said one evening, her tone neutral but laced with curiosity. "He's my son," I replied simply, not looking up from the book I was reading. She didn't say anything else, but I could feel her watching me, trying to gauge my mood. That was another part of my strategy. Emotional distance. I stopped reacting to her provocations. When she came home late with flimsy excuses, I didn't question her. When she made snide comments about my work habits or how boring I'd become, I let them slide off me like water. At first, she seemed relieved, as if my lack of reaction gave her the green light to continue whatever she was doing. But over time, my silence started to frustrate her. "Do you even care anymore?" She snapped one night after I calmly declined her invitation to join her at another one of Claire's gatherings. I looked at her, my expression unreadable. "I care about Ethan. I care about keeping this house stable. Beyond that, I don't see the point in arguing about things that don't matter." She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. For a moment, she looked almost vulnerable, as if she was realizing the distance between us for the first time. I didn't let it get to me. Vulnerability was another tactic she used, whether she was aware of it or not, a way to pull me back in when I started to drift too far. But this time, I wasn't playing her game. Instead, I focused on quietly gathering information. I knew enough to suspect the worst, but suspicion wasn't enough. I needed proof, not just for my peace of mind, but to protect myself and Ethan when the time came to confront her. I started paying attention to the details, the times she left the house, the excuses she gave, the way her behavior shifted after certain phone calls or texts. I noticed patterns I hadn't seen before, subtle clues that painted a clearer picture of what was going on. Victor was a huge help during this time. I didn't tell him everything, but I gave him enough to understand the gravity of the situation. "Keep your head," he advised during one of our late-night conversations. "Don't let her bait you. The moment you lose control, you lose leverage." He was right. I couldn't afford to let my emotions get the better of me. Laura, meanwhile, seemed to sense that something was off, though she couldn't quite put her finger on it. She started acting more erratic. One moment sweet and affectionate, the next cold and distant. It was as if she was testing me, trying to see if I would crack. But I didn't. One evening, as we sat across from each other at the dinner table, Ethan happily chatting about his day, Laura suddenly turned to me. "You're awfully quiet these days," she said, her tone light but probing. I shrugged. "Not much to say." She narrowed her eyes, studying me. "It feels like you're pulling away." I met her gaze, my expression calm. "Maybe I'm just giving you space." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. She didn't respond, instead turning her attention back to her plate. I wasn't sure how long I could keep this up. The emotional toll was heavier than I expected, and every day felt like a balancing act between maintaining the illusion of normalcy and preparing for the storm I knew was coming. But for now, the strategy was working. Ethan was happy. The house was calm. And Laura? Laura was starting to realize that the control she thought she had wasn't as solid as she believed. The cracks in our marriage were widening, but for the first time, I felt like I was the one holding the hammer. The night of the party arrived, and I knew it was time to put my plan into motion. This wasn't about revenge. Not entirely. It was about setting the record straight, about showing Laura and Julian that their games wouldn't go unnoticed, much less unchallenged. Laura had been excited about this event for weeks. She'd spent hours picking out the perfect dress, talking about the guest list, and mentioning, far too casually, that Julian would also be attending. "You'll come, won't you?" she asked that morning, her tone more of a challenge than a request. "Of course," I replied evenly. I wouldn't miss it. Her eyes flicked to mine, searching for some hidden meaning in my words, but I gave her nothing. That evening, as we got ready, she was a vision in a crimson gown that hugged her figure in all the right places. She twirled in front of the mirror, catching my eye. "What do you think?" "You look stunning," I said, and I meant it. Her smile faltered, as if she'd expected me to say more, to react differently. but I simply adjusted my tie and grabbed my jacket. Shall we? The venue was as grand as expected. Chandeliers sparkling overhead, waiters weaving through the crowd with trays of champagne, and an orchestra playing softly in the background. Laura immediately slipped into her element, greeting people with her dazzling smile and effortlessly charming demeanor. I stayed close, but not too close. I wanted to see how she behaved when she thought I wasn't watching. It didn't take long for Julian to appear, cutting through the crowd with his usual air of entitlement. His eyes lit up when he saw her, and I watched as he approached her with the confidence of a man who believed he'd already won. "Laura," he said, his voice smooth, "you look breathtaking tonight." She laughed, the sound light and airy, as if his words were a harmless compliment. But I saw the way her shoulders relaxed, the way her gaze lingered on him a moment too long. I stayed back, watching as they fell into an easy rhythm of conversation. Julian leaned in closer than necessary, his hand brushing her arm as they spoke. She didn't pull away. Other guests began to notice. Whispers rippled through the crowd, subtle glances exchanged as people tried to piece together what was happening. Perfect. I waited for the right moment, letting the tension build. When Julian placed his hand on the small of her back and guided her toward the balcony, I decided it was time to act. I followed them at a leisurely pace, pausing just inside the doorway to the balcony. They were standing close, their heads bent together in what appeared to be an intimate conversation. "Julian," I said, my voice cutting through the quiet hum of the evening. He stiffened, his smile faltering as he turned to face me. "Damien," he said, recovering quickly. "I didn't see you there." "I'm sure you didn't," I replied, stepping onto the balcony. Laura's eyes widened, and for a moment she looked genuinely nervous. "Damien, we were just talking," I finished for her. "Yes, I can see that." Julian straightened, his cocky demeanor returning. "Laura and I were reminiscing about old times. Nothing inappropriate, of course." The words were carefully chosen, but his tone dripped with condescension, as if he believed he had the upper hand. I smiled, though there was no warmth in it. "Of course. Why would it be inappropriate? You're just an old friend, after all." He blinked, clearly taken aback by my calm response. He had expected anger, jealousy, maybe even a scene. But I had no intention of giving him what he wanted. "Julian," I said, stepping closer, "you've always been good at inserting yourself where you don't belong. It's almost impressive." His jaw tightened, but he forced a laugh. "I'm not sure what you mean." "Oh, I think you do," I replied, my voice low but firm. "But let me be clear, whatever game you think you're playing, it ends now." Laura shifted uncomfortably, her gaze darting between us. "Damien, there's no need for this." I held up a hand, cutting her off. "No need for what, Laura?" "To address the obvious?" The weight of my words hung in the air, and for the first time, Julian looked uncertain. "Here's the thing, Julian," I continued. "I don't have time for petty games or insecure men trying to prove something. You want to undermine me? Fine. But doing it through my wife? That's pathetic." Julian's mask slipped for a moment, his expression darkening. "You think you can just dismiss me?" he asked, his voice tight. I smiled again, this time with genuine amusement. "Dismiss you, Julian? You dismissed yourself the moment you thought I wouldn't notice." The silence that followed was deafening. Even Laura, who had always been quick with a response, seemed at a loss for words. I turned to her then, my gaze steady. "Enjoy the party," I said simply before walking away. As I re-entered the main hall, I felt the weight of dozens of eyes on me. The whispers had grown louder, the tension in the room palpable. I didn't care. Julian and Laura could stew in their own discomfort for the rest of the night. I had said my piece, and the ball was now firmly in their court. What they did next didn't matter. I had already won. Because in that moment, I realized something important. I didn't need to fight for Laura's loyalty or Julian's respect. I didn't need to prove anything to anyone. All I needed was to hold my head high and move forward, knowing that no matter what came next, I was in control. I didn't see it happen firsthand, but the change in Laura was undeniable. At first, I thought it might be another one of her acts, a tactic to regain control or manipulate the narrative in her favor. But as the days passed, her demeanor shifted in a way that felt raw, unpolished, and almost regretful. It began after the party. She avoided me for a while, retreating into herself like someone who had been forced to look in a mirror and didn't like what she saw. I let her stew, content to focus on Ethan and my work, knowing that whatever storm she was facing internally, she would have to face it alone. I noticed small things. She spent less time on her phone, no longer obsessively checking it for Julian's messages. Her laughter, once loud and performative, was rare and hollow now. Even her conversations with Claire, which used to dominate the house, grew shorter and less frequent. Then one evening she came to me, her expression hesitant. "I'm going out," she said, her voice softer than usual. I looked up from the book I was reading. "With Claire?" She nodded, avoiding my gaze. "We need to talk." I didn't respond, simply watching her as she grabbed her coat and left. Claire was waiting for her at their favorite cafe, the one they always used for their long, gossipy lunches. But tonight was different. Claire looked uncomfortable, her usual confidence replaced by a nervous energy. "Thanks for meeting me," Laura said, sitting down across from her. Claire nodded, fiddling with her coffee cup. "Of course. You sounded upset." Laura sighed, running a hand through her hair. "I don't even know where to start." Claire hesitated, then leaned forward slightly. "Is this about Damien? Or Julian?" The mention of Julian's name made Laura flinch. "Both," she admitted. "Everything." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Claire took a deep breath. "I think I owe you an apology." Laura looked up, startled. "What?" "I've been a terrible friend," Claire said, her voice trembling. "I encouraged you to chase something that wasn't real. I thought I was helping you feel better, but I see now that I was just feeding your insecurities." Laura stared at her, the weight of her words sinking in. "I saw the way Damien looked at you at that party," Claire continued. "He wasn't angry, he was disappointed, hurt, and I realized that I've been wrong about him. He's a good man, Laura, better than I ever gave him credit for." Tears welled in Laura's eyes. She had been trying so hard to justify her actions, to convince herself that she deserved the attention Julian gave her. But hearing Claire say it, that Damien had been hurt, not angry, shattered the fragile wall she'd built around herself. "It's not just you," Laura said quietly. "I've been selfish. I've taken Damien for granted. He worked so hard for us, for Ethan, and all I've done is complain that it wasn't enough." Claire reached across the table, squeezing her hand. "You can fix this, Laura, but you have to be honest with him. And with yourself." When she came home that night, her face was a mix of exhaustion and determination. I didn't ask where she'd been, or what she'd talked about. I just watched as she slipped off her coat and sat down across from me at the dining table. "We need to talk," she said, her voice steady but soft. I set my book aside, meeting her gaze. "I'm listening." She hesitated, taking a deep breath. "I've been a terrible wife." The words hung in the air, heavy with emotion. I didn't respond, waiting for her to continue. "I let my insecurities get the better of me," she admitted. "I wanted to feel wanted. And Julian made me feel that way, but it wasn't real. It was shallow and selfish. And I see that now." Her eyes filled with tears, and for the first time, I saw genuine remorse. "I thought I was missing something in our marriage," she said. "But the truth is, I was the one who wasn't giving enough. You've been nothing but patient and supportive, and I've been blind to how much you've sacrificed for us." I leaned back in my chair, my arms crossed. "Why now? Why the sudden change?" She wiped her eyes, her voice breaking. "Because I realized that I've been chasing something meaningless while risking everything that actually matters. And I don't want to lose you. Or Ethan. I want to fix this, Damien. I want to fix us." I studied her for a long moment, weighing her words. There was no denying the sincerity in her voice, the pain in her eyes. But sincerity alone wasn't enough. "This isn't something you can fix overnight," I said finally. "Trust takes time to rebuild. And right now, I don't know if I can give you that." Her face crumpled, but she nodded. I understand, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes. I hope you'll give me a chance. I stood, my expression unreadable. We'll see. As I walked away, I felt a strange mix of emotions, anger, sadness, and a flicker of something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Laura had a long road ahead of her, and so did I. But for the first time, it felt like we were at least starting to walk in the same direction. Whether we could meet in the middle was still uncertain, but for now, it was a step forward. It took weeks of watching, waiting, and gathering evidence before I felt ready. Not ready to strike back out of anger. No, that wasn't it. This wasn't about revenge. It was about clarity, about laying everything on the table so there would be no more lies, no more games. The folder sat on my desk for days, its contents meticulously organized. Messages, photos, timestamps, all the pieces of the puzzle that painted a picture I could no longer ignore. I didn't need to look at them anymore. I had memorized every detail. I waited until Ethan was asleep, tucked safely in his bed, oblivious to the storm brewing beneath our roof. Then I called her into the living room, the weight of what was about to happen pressing down on me. Laura entered cautiously, sensing that something was off. She was wearing one of those comfortable old sweaters she only pulled out on quiet nights at home. It struck me how different she looked from the woman I'd watched at parties, laughing and glowing under someone else's attention. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice unsure. I gestured for her to sit on the couch, and she complied, her eyes searching mine for answers. I didn't sit beside her. Instead, I stood a few feet away, the folder in my hand. "We need to talk," I began, my voice steady. She nodded slowly. "Okay." I placed the folder on the coffee table between us. "I need you to look at this." Her brow furrowed as she reached for it, her fingers trembling slightly. She opened it, and the color drained from her face as she flipped through the pages. The texts from Julian, the photos of them at the hotel, the call logs. Everything was there, laid out in black and white. When she finally closed the folder, her hands fell to her lap, clutching the edge of her sweater as though it could shield her from the reality in front of her. She began, but her voice broke. She swallowed hard and tried again. "I can explain." "Don't," I said sharply. "Don't insult me with excuses. I've heard enough lies." Tears welled in her eyes, spilling over as she shook her head. "I wasn't trying to hurt you," she whispered. I laughed bitterly, the sound hollow. "You weren't trying to hurt me? Laura, every choice you made hurt me. Every text, every meeting, every lie, it all tore me apart piece by piece. And now you sit here and tell me you didn't mean to?" She broke then, her sobs filling the room. "I was lost," she cried. "I felt invisible, unappreciated. Julian made me feel seen, but it was a mistake. I see that now. I see how selfish I've been." I crossed my arms, watching her crumble. Part of me wanted to comfort her, to reach out and tell her it would be okay. But I couldn't. Not this time. "This isn't just about you feeling lost," I said. "It's about trust, Laura. You shattered it. You shattered us. And now I'm left trying to figure out how to protect Ethan from the fallout of your decisions." She looked up at me then, her eyes pleading. "Please, Damien, don't give up on me. Don't give up on us. I'll do anything to fix this." I sighed, running a hand through my hair. "It's not that simple." Reaching into my jacket pocket, I pulled out the divorce papers and placed them on top of the folder. Her eyes widened as she stared at them, her breath hitching. "No," she whispered. "Damien, please, don't do this." I sat down across from her, leaning forward so our eyes met. "I didn't come to this decision lightly," I said. "But I can't keep living like this, pretending everything is fine when it's not. My priority is Ethan and making sure he grows up in a stable, loving environment. I can't let him see his parents living in a house built on lies." She shook her head, fresh tears streaming down her cheeks. "I can change," she said desperately. "I'll prove it to you. I'll go to therapy. I'll cut off all contact with Julian, whatever it takes. Just don't end this, please." I studied her, trying to find the truth in her words. There was sincerity there, I could see that. But sincerity alone wasn't enough. "This is your decision now," I said finally. "You can sign those papers and walk away, or you can stay and fight to rebuild what's left. But if you choose to stay, understand this. It won't be easy. Trust doesn't come back overnight, and I won't let you off the hook for what you've done." Her lip trembled as she stared at the papers. "I don't want to walk away," she said softly. "I don't want to lose you, Damien. I don't want to lose our family." I leaned back, exhaustion washing over me. "Then show me," I said. "Not with words, but with actions. Prove to me that you're willing to put in the work. Because if you can't, if you even think about betraying me again, I won't give you another chance. Do you understand?" She nodded, her hands trembling as she reached for the papers. But instead of signing them, she pushed them away, her tear-filled eyes meeting mine. "I'll prove it," she said, her voice steady despite the tears. "I'll fight for us." I didn't respond, standing and walking toward the stairs. "We'll see," I said over my shoulder. As I climbed the stairs, leaving her behind in the living room, I felt a mix of emotions: anger, sadness, and a faint glimmer of hope. I didn't know if Laura could truly change, if we could rebuild what we had lost. But for now, I was willing to give her the chance to try. Not for her, and not even for me. For Ethan. Trust is a fragile thing. Once broken, it's nearly impossible to rebuild. That was the thought running through my mind every time I looked at Laura in the weeks after our confrontation. She had made her choice. She pushed the divorce papers aside and vowed to fight for our family. But words alone couldn't erase the damage she had done. I didn't make it easy for her. I couldn't. If she was going to earn my trust back, it would take more than apologies and promises. It would take action, consistency, and time. The first step she took was cutting Julian out of her life. It wasn't dramatic, no tearful goodbyes or drawn-out explanations. She simply deleted his number, blocked him on every platform, and removed any trace of him from her world. I didn't ask her to do it. I didn't have to. She knew it was the bare minimum required to start this process. But even as she made these changes, I kept my guard up. Words are easy, habits are harder. She surprised me when she started therapy. "I need help," she admitted one night as we sat at the dinner table after Ethan had gone to bed. "I can't fix this on my own, and I don't want to pretend I have all the answers anymore." It was a small moment, but it felt significant. For the first time, she was acknowledging the depth of her mistakes and taking responsibility for her role in our fractured marriage. She began attending weekly sessions, focusing not only on our relationship but also on herself, her insecurities, her need for external validation, and the root causes of the choices she had made. I watched from a distance, unsure if this was another performance or genuine growth. Over time, though, her changes became undeniable. She started spending more time at home, focusing on Ethan in ways she hadn't before. She helped him with his homework, cheered him on at soccer games, and even joined us for our weekend fort-building sessions in the living room. Ethan noticed the difference immediately. "Mom's really fun now," he told me one night as I tucked him into bed. His smile was wide, his eyes bright with a joy I hadn't seen in a long time. It was bittersweet. While I was grateful for the effort she was making, I couldn't ignore the fact that it had taken near destruction for her to step up as the wife and mother we both needed her to be. As Laura worked to repair our family, news about Julian started trickling in. Apparently, I wasn't the only one who had seen through his charm. Word spread quickly among the social circles he once ruled, painting him as a manipulative opportunist who thrived on exploiting vulnerability. One by one, his connections began to abandon him. Invitations to high-profile events dried up, business opportunities vanished, and the whispers that had once fueled his ego turned into a weapon against him. I didn't celebrate his downfall, though I'd be lying if I said it didn't feel like justice. Julian had built his empire on deception and arrogance, and now it was crumbling beneath him. Meanwhile, Laura continued her journey toward redemption. She didn't push me for forgiveness or demand immediate reconciliation. Instead, she gave me space, understanding that rebuilding trust would take time and patience. She focused on her actions, letting them speak louder than words ever could. One night, as we sat on the couch in silence, she finally broke the quiet. "I know I've hurt you," she said, her voice trembling. "And I know I might never fully earn your trust back. But I need you to know that I'm not the same person I was before. I'm trying, Damien. For you, for Ethan, and for myself. I looked at her, studying her face. There was no trace of the defiance or arrogance that had once defined her. She looked vulnerable, raw, and, dare I say it, sincere. I see that, I said after a long pause, and I appreciate it. But this isn't just about what you do for me or Ethan. This is about who you are when no one's watching. That's what will matter in the long run. She nodded, her eyes shining with unshed tears. I understand. As the weeks turned into months, I started to let my guard down, little by little. I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, this could work. We weren't the same people we had been at the start of our marriage. The love that had once been effortless now required conscious effort, and the scars of the past would never fully fade. But there was something new growing between us. Something deeper, forged in pain and resilience. One evening, after Ethan had gone to bed, Laura and I sat outside on the patio watching the stars. "I've been thinking," she said softly, breaking the comfortable silence. "About what?" I asked. "About us," she replied. "About everything we've been through. I don't know if we'll ever be what we were before, but maybe that's okay. Maybe we can be something new." Her words resonated with me. She was right. We couldn't go back to who we used to be. Too much had happened. Too much had changed. But that didn't mean we couldn't move forward. "I think you're right," I said. "It won't be easy, but if we're both willing to try, maybe we can find our way back to each other." She smiled, a small, tentative smile that felt more real than any I'd seen in years. In that moment, I didn't know what the future held for us. Maybe we'd rebuild our marriage into something stronger, or maybe we'd realize that we were better apart. But for the first time in a long time, I felt something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in months. Hope. And sometimes, hope is enough to take the first step forward.